I should have known something was wrong the moment Martin Reeves pulled me aside that Tuesday afternoon. His office door clicked shut behind us with a finality that made my stomach drop. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he gestured toward the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. I'd been with Octagon Technologies for 6 years, working my way up from junior analyst to senior compliance officer. I'd never been summoned like this before, not with that particular look in his eyes. The kind of look that said whatever came next would change everything. "Kelly," Martin began, his fingers drumming against a manila folder I didn't recognize. "I need to talk to you about the Q4 compliance review." I nodded, expecting praise. Our preliminary findings had been thorough, methodical. I'd spent 3 months combing through procurement contracts, vendor relationships, financial disclosures. Everything was documented, cross-referenced, ready for the external audit scheduled in 2 weeks. I'd worked weekends, stayed late into the evening, missed my sister's birthday dinner because I was so committed to getting this right. "I'm removing you from the project." The words hung in the air like smoke. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. Outside his window, I could see the parking lot where my car sat in its usual spot, the spot I'd parked in every morning for 6 years. Everything suddenly felt surreal. "Excuse me?" Martin's jaw tightened. He was a man who'd built his career on calculated decisions, on knowing exactly what to say and when. But right now, he looked uncomfortable. His eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. Instead, they focused on something over my left shoulder, and I realized his hands were trembling slightly as they gripped that mysterious folder. "You're being reassigned. Effective immediately. Dominic Stanton will take over the compliance review." Dominic Stanton. A junior associate who'd been with the company barely 18 months. Someone who nodded along in meetings, who never questioned discrepancies, who treated every executive decision as gospel. I'd trained Dominic myself during his first month. He was competent enough at basic tasks, but he lacked the critical thinking skills necessary for complex compliance work. He followed procedures without understanding why they existed. "Martin, I don't understand. The review is nearly complete. We're 2 weeks from the audit. Bringing in someone new now would compromise the entire process. Dominic doesn't have the background knowledge to. The decision is final, Kelly." His tone left no room for negotiation. I sat there, my mind racing through possibilities. Had I made an error? Missed something critical? But no, I'd triple-checked every finding, every footnote. I'd consulted with external legal counsel on ambiguous regulatory questions. My work was airtight. "Can you at least tell me why?" Martin stood, turning toward the window that overlooked the parking lot 5 stories below. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his face, aging him 10 years in an instant. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're too honest for this." The words hit me like a physical blow. Too honest? What kind of reason was that? What kind of company tells their compliance officer they're too honest? Isn't that literally the job description? To be honest, to maintain integrity, to ensure the organization operates within legal and ethical boundaries? I opened my mouth to respond, to demand a real explanation, but something in his posture stopped me. The slump of his shoulders. The way his hand gripped the window frame like he was holding himself upright. This wasn't a man exercising power. This was a man following orders he didn't agree with. This was a man who'd already lost whatever battle he'd fought on my behalf. So I simply nodded. I gathered my things from the compliance department in a daze. My colleagues watched with curious, worried expressions as I boxed up 6 years of files, notes, reference materials. Angela from Accounts Payable actually looked like she might cry. We'd worked together on countless vendor reconciliations, and she understood better than most how meticulous I was. Nobody asked questions. In corporate America, silence is survival. Speaking up means painting a target on your own back. The weight of that box in my arms felt like carrying a coffin. 6 years of my professional life, reduced to paper and folders. My framed certification from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, the one I'd been so proud to earn. The coffee mug my team had given me last Christmas with "World's Okayest Compliance Officer" printed on it. The stress ball shaped like a dollar sign that I'd squeezed through countless difficult conversations with executives who didn't want to hear about regulatory requirements. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Martin's words, dissecting them for hidden meaning. Too honest for this. For what? The compliance review? The audit? Octagon Technologies itself? I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching the headlights from passing cars sweep across the walls, creating moving shadows that felt ominous in the darkness. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and made tea. Chamomile, the kind my mother always said would calm nerves. It didn't work. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, staring at a blank screen, wondering if I should update my resume. 6 years at one company looked good on paper, but being removed from a major project weeks before completion? That would raise questions in interviews. Questions I didn't have good answers for. By morning, I'd made a decision. If they wanted me off the review, fine. But I wasn't going to pretend I didn't know what I knew. Day 1 after my removal, I went through my personal copies of the compliance files. Not the official documents, those had been confiscated when I left the department, packed into boxes by security personnel who treated me like I was stealing corporate secrets rather than leaving with my own notes. But throughout my career, I'd developed a habit of keeping detailed personal records, observations that didn't always make it into formal reports. Instincts. Patterns. Red flags that were too vague to document officially but too concerning to ignore. And there were red flags everywhere. 3 vendor contracts with identical negotiation timelines, down to the day. That alone wasn't necessarily suspicious, but when I cross-referenced the vendors, I found they all shared the same registered agent. Different company names, different business addresses, but the same legal representative. That was unusual. Then I noticed the payment patterns. Each vendor received monthly transfers that varied by no more than 3%, as if someone was carefully calculating amounts to stay just below reporting thresholds. Purchase orders that bypassed standard approval workflows, authorized by executives who shouldn't have had that level of procurement authority. I'd flagged this during the review, noting it in my preliminary findings as a process control weakness. Martin had told me not to worry about it, that these were legacy practices from before the current compliance framework was implemented. But when I checked the dates, I realized these irregular approvals had started only 2 years ago. Long after our current procedures were established. Wire transfers to overseas accounts that technically complied with international banking regulations but felt off. The accounts were in countries with strong banking privacy laws. Not tax havens exactly, but jurisdictions that made it difficult to trace beneficial ownership. The stated purpose for each transfer was consulting services, but when I'd requested documentation of the actual work performed, I'd been told the materials were proprietary and covered under non-disclosure agreements. Nothing overtly illegal. Nothing you could point to and say definitively, this is fraud. But taken together? The pattern was unmistakable. Someone at Octagon Technologies was moving money in ways designed to avoid scrutiny, creating just enough paper trail to appear legitimate while obscuring the actual flow of funds. I made a spreadsheet. Not an official document, just a personal reference. I tracked every questionable transaction, every procedural bypass, every coincidence that seemed a little too coincidental. The numbers told a story. Over the past 3 fiscal years, approximately $47 million had moved through these irregular channels. $47 million that should have appeared in standard expense categories but somehow didn't show up in the right places on financial statements. Day 2, I drafted an email to the external auditors. Then I deleted it. Then I rewrote it. Then I deleted it again. What was I doing? If I sent this, I'd be going over Martin's head, over the entire executive chain. I'd be positioning myself as a whistleblower, and whistleblowers rarely come out unscathed. I'd read the statistics. 70% face retaliation. Many never work in their industry again. Some receive death threats. But if I didn't send it? I thought about Martin's face. The defeat in his eyes. He knew. He absolutely knew there was something wrong, and he'd been told to bury it. Someone higher up the chain had ordered him to remove me, to replace me with someone more malleable, someone who would polish the compliance review into something presentable for the auditors rather than accurate. I thought about my father. He'd worked in construction for 30 years, and he'd always told me that integrity meant doing the right thing even when it cost you something. Especially when it cost you something. Anybody can be honest when it's convenient, he'd say. Character is what you do when being honest means sacrifice. I didn't send the email. Not yet. but I saved the draft. Day 3 started like any other Wednesday. I arrived at my new assignment in the risk assessment department, a lateral move that felt more like exile. My new supervisor, Helen Carstairs, was pleasant but distant, giving me busy work that kept me occupied without engaging my actual skills. She had me reviewing insurance policy renewals, comparing coverage limits and premium rates. Work that any administrative assistant could have handled. Work that felt designed to keep me busy while not actually trusting me with anything meaningful. The risk assessment department was on the 3rd floor, 2 floors below my old office in compliance. The space was more cramped, the cubicles closer together. My new desk faced a wall instead of a window. Someone had left a wilted plant in the corner that nobody had bothered to water. The whole environment felt like a message: this is where we put people we want to forget about. I was reviewing insurance policy renewals when Martin burst into the open office floor. "Where is Kelly Jakeson?" His voice cracked across the room like thunder. Every head turned. Helen stood, her face pale, clearly unprepared for this level of disruption. "Mr. Reeves, she's right." But Martin was already striding toward my desk, his face flushed red, his tie loosened like he'd been pulling at it. In his hand was a printed document, pages crumpled from his grip. His hair, normally perfectly styled, stuck up at odd angles. His shirt had come partially untucked. I'd never seen him look so disheveled. Why did the auditors demand an investigation? The question exploded from him, loud enough that people 3 rows over stopped typing. My mouth went dry. Around us, colleagues pretended to work while obviously listening to every word. Someone's phone kept buzzing on their desk, but they didn't pick it up. What? The external auditors. Martin's hand slammed down on my desk, making my coffee cup jump. Dark liquid sloshed over the rim, creating a spreading stain across the insurance documents I'd been reviewing. They've requested a full forensic investigation into our procurement processes. They want access to everything. Internal communications, email records, vendor negotiations from the past 5 years. They specifically cited irregularities that warrant deeper examination. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't sent that email. I'd come close, so close, but I hadn't actually done it. The draft was still sitting in my personal email account, unsent. "Martin, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me." His voice dropped to a harsh whisper, but the intensity only increased. He leaned across my desk, close enough that I could smell coffee on his breath and see the broken capillaries in his eyes. "You're the only one who knew the details. You're the only one who could have contacted them. You're the only one who would have had the documentation to back up these kinds of allegations." I didn't contact anyone. The truth of it must have shown on my face because Martin's certainty wavered. He straightened, the papers in his hand shaking slightly. His eyes searched mine, looking for deception and finding only confusion. "Then how?" That's when I understood. Someone else had seen what I'd seen. Someone else had put the pieces together. And while I'd been debating whether to speak up, drafting and deleting emails, they'd already made the call. "Who else worked on the review?" I asked quietly. Martin's eyes widened. The color that had flushed his face drained away in an instant. "Dominic took over your files. He was supposed to clean them up, prepare them for the audit, make sure everything was presentable." Presentable. What a careful word. What a damning word. Not accurate, not complete, not thorough. Presentable. As in, arranged to look good rather than to reflect reality. "Maybe," I said slowly, "Dominic is more honest than you thought." The color drained from Martin's face. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving the crumpled papers on my desk. His footsteps echoed through the suddenly silent office. Someone coughed. A phone buzzed again. Slowly, carefully, people returned to their work, though I could feel their eyes on me even when they pretended to look at their screens. As the office buzz resumed around me, I glanced down at what he dropped. It was a preliminary auditor's report, marked confidential in red letters across the top. And there, in the 3rd paragraph, was a sentence that made my blood run cold. "Based on documentation provided by internal sources, we have identified a pattern of financial misconduct that appears to involve senior leadership at multiple levels of the organization." Senior leadership. Multiple levels. This wasn't about a few suspicious contracts. This was bigger. Much bigger. This was the kind of language auditors used when they'd found systematic corruption, when the rot went all the way to the top. I read further. The report referenced specific transaction dates, vendor names, amounts. All the red flags I'd identified in my review. All the irregularities I'd documented before being removed. Someone had given the auditors a roadmap, and they'd followed it straight to evidence of fraud. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Helen sent me home early, claiming I looked unwell. She wasn't wrong. My hands trembled as I drove, my mind spinning through implications. If senior leadership was involved, that meant executives. C-suite. Maybe even the CEO, Douglas Whitmore, the man who'd founded Octagon Technologies 20 years ago and built it into a billion-dollar enterprise through what everyone assumed was innovation and business acumen. I'd worked directly with Douglas twice. Once during a company-wide strategic planning session where he'd spoken passionately about corporate responsibility and ethical business practices. The second time in a smaller meeting about expanding our compliance framework to meet new industry regulations. He'd seemed genuine, passionate about the company's mission to develop sustainable technology solutions. He'd talked about legacy, about building something that would last, about creating value for all stakeholders, not just shareholders. But I'd also seen him laugh off regulatory concerns, brush aside ethics committee recommendations with jokes about government overreach and red tape. I'd watched him override the legal department's objections to an aggressive tax strategy because, as he'd put it, we're here to make money, not win awards for playing it safe. Had I been blind? Or had I simply not wanted to see? It's easy to ignore warning signs when acknowledging them would force you to act. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally I didn't answer those, but something made me pick up. Hello? Ms. Jakeson, this is Christine Holloway with the Securities and Exchange Commission. My stomach dropped through the floor. The SEC. The federal agency responsible for enforcing securities laws and protecting investors. They didn't call people to chat about the weather. I'm calling because your name has come up in connection with an ongoing investigation into Octagon Technologies. We understand you were recently removed from an internal compliance review. We'd like to speak with you about what you found during that review. The room seemed to tilt. I sat down heavily on my couch, nearly dropping the phone. I didn't report anything to the SEC. We're aware. But someone did. And we need to corroborate their claims. Would you be willing to meet with us tomorrow morning? Tomorrow morning. Less than 12 hours away. I'd gone from trying to decide whether to blow the whistle to being contacted by federal investigators who were already pursuing an active case. Do I need a lawyer? That's your right, Ms. Jakeson. But for the record, you're not a target of this investigation. We believe you may have information that could help us understand the scope of potential violations. You worked on the compliance review that identified these irregularities. Your insights would be valuable. Potential violations. The careful language of federal investigators who already know the truth but need proof that would hold up in court. I'll meet with you. Thank you. We'll send you the address. Come to the federal building downtown, 9th floor. 8 a.m. And Ms. Jakeson? Don't discuss this call with anyone at Octagon Technologies. For your own protection. The line went dead. I sat on my couch for 3 hours, staring at nothing. My entire career was at Octagon. My 401k, my health insurance, my professional reputation, my connections in the industry. If I cooperated with the SEC, I'd be burning it all down. Companies don't hire whistleblowers. They see you as a liability, someone who might turn on them next. It doesn't matter if you were right, if you prevented fraud, if you protected investors. You're still marked as someone willing to go outside the chain of command. But if I didn't cooperate, if I refused to help, what did that make me? An accomplice? Someone who knew about fraud and chose to protect the perpetrators? Around midnight, I pulled out my personal copies of the compliance notes again. I read through every observation, every red flag I'd documented. The overseas wire transfers, always in amounts just under reporting thresholds. The shell companies used as intermediaries, registered in jurisdictions that made ownership tracking difficult. The contracts approved outside normal channels by executives who shouldn't have had that authority. The pattern of financial movements that technically followed the letter of banking laws while violating their spirit. And I thought about Martin's words. You're too honest for this. He'd meant it as a warning. As a way of protecting me from whatever was coming. He'd seen the storm on the horizon and tried to get me out of the way before it hit. But maybe, just maybe, being too honest was exactly what this situation needed. The next morning, I met with Christine Holloway and 2 other SEC investigators in a nondescript office building downtown. The federal building looked imposing from the outside, all concrete and glass, the kind of architecture designed to remind you of the government's power. Inside, it was fluorescent lights and beige walls, institutional and impersonal. The 9th floor was dedicated to enforcement. I checked in at security, surrendered my phone, and was escorted to a conference room with no windows and a table that looked like it had hosted 1,000 interrogations. Christine Holloway was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that suggested she didn't miss much. The other 2 investigators introduced themselves as Andrew Carlisle and Francine West. Andrew was clearly the senior member of the team, gray-haired and measured in his movements. Francine looked fresh out of graduate school, taking notes on a laptop with quick, precise keystrokes. They asked questions for 4 hours. I answered every single one, providing dates, names, amounts, patterns. I showed them my notes, explained my methodology, walked them through the inconsistencies I'd flagged. They recorded everything, stopping occasionally to ask clarifying questions or to request additional detail about specific transactions. Walk us through this vendor contract again, Andrew said, pointing to a line in my notes. You flagged it as unusual. Why? The contract was for consulting services, I explained. But when I requested documentation of the work product, I was told everything was covered under an NDA. That's not abnormal by itself. But when I looked at the payment schedule, I noticed the amounts corresponded almost exactly to quarterly executive bonuses. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Francine's fingers flew across her keyboard. Did you share this observation with your superiors? Yes. Martin Reeves, my direct supervisor. He told me it was probably coincidental, that I was reading too much into the timing. But you didn't believe that? No. Because when I checked previous years, the pattern didn't exist. This payment structure only started after Douglas Whitmore's compensation package was restructured to include more performance-based bonuses. It looked like someone was creating a mechanism to funnel bonus money through external vendors to avoid disclosure requirements. Christine leaned forward. That's a serious allegation. Did you have evidence beyond the timing correlation? Not definitive proof. But I had enough red flags to warrant deeper investigation. Which is why I documented everything in my preliminary findings. I recommended that we engage forensic accountants before finalizing the audit. And what happened to that recommendation? I was removed from the review before I could pursue it. The questions continued. They wanted to know about every executive I'd interacted with, every conversation about the compliance review, every time I'd been told to modify findings or soften language in reports. They asked about company culture, about whether executives viewed compliance as a partnership or an obstacle. They asked whether I'd ever been pressured to overlook irregularities. When we finished, Christine leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. Ms. Jackson, I want you to understand something. What you've described suggests systematic financial fraud at the executive level. If our investigation confirms this, Octagon Technologies is looking at criminal charges, civil penalties, and likely bankruptcy. Employees will lose their jobs. Shareholders will lose their investments. Vendors won't be paid for services rendered. This will be ugly. Messy. Devastating for a lot of innocent people. I know. And you're comfortable with that? I thought about the question. Was I comfortable destroying the company I devoted 6 years to? Comfortable with the chaos that would follow? With the lives that would be disrupted? With my colleagues losing their jobs through no fault of their own? I'm comfortable telling the truth, I said finally. What happens after that isn't up to me. If Octagon Technologies fails because executives committed fraud, that's on them. Not on me for reporting it. The company was already doomed the moment they decided to break the law. I'm just accelerating the inevitable. Christine nodded slowly. We'll be in touch. In the meantime, continue your normal work routine. Don't give any indication that we've spoken. And if anyone at Octagon pressures you or threatens you in any way, contact us immediately. Here's my direct line. She slid a business card across the table. Heavy cardstock, government seal embossed in the corner. The physical weight of federal authority. I returned to the office that afternoon feeling like I was walking through a dream. Everything looked the same but felt different. The elevator that carried me to the third floor. The badge reader that let me through the security doors. My cubicle with its wilted plant and wall view. All of it familiar but alien, like seeing your childhood home after years away. Martin avoided eye contact when I passed him in the hallway. His face looked drawn, older somehow. He'd lost weight in just a few days. Dominic Stanton, the junior associate who'd taken over my review, looked terrified every time someone mentioned the audit. He jumped when his phone rang, flinched when executives walked past his desk. The office atmosphere had changed. People spoke in hushed tones. Lunch conversations that used to be casual and jovial now felt forced. Everyone knew something was wrong, but nobody wanted to talk about it directly. It was like working in a building where everyone could smell smoke but nobody wanted to be the first to yell fire. 2 weeks later, the hammer fell. Federal agents arrived at Octagon Technologies headquarters at 8 in the morning. I was at my desk, reviewing yet another insurance policy renewal, when I heard the commotion. Voices raised in alarm. Footsteps running. Someone shouting about lawyers. They executed search warrants across 3 floors, seizing computers, files, servers. Men and women in dark suits and FBI windbreakers moved through the office with efficient precision, unplugging equipment, photographing documents, escorting confused employees away from their desks. The scene looked like something from a television drama, except it was real, and these were my colleagues having their workspaces dismantled. Douglas Whitmore was escorted from the building in handcuffs at 9:15. I watched from the third-floor window as they led him across the parking lot. He'd aged visibly since I'd last seen him. His trademark confident stride was gone, replaced by a shuffling walk that made him look decades older. Reporters had already gathered, cameras recording every moment. By noon, the footage would be playing on every news channel. CFO Lawrence Bennett followed at 9:30. Then Chief Operating Officer Ruth Fitzgerald. Then Martin Reeves. Martin's arrest hit me harder than I'd expected. I'd known it was coming, had known he was involved at some level, but seeing him in handcuffs, his face pale and drawn, made it real in a way the abstract knowledge hadn't. He'd tried to protect me by removing me from the review. He'd known what was happening and had been trying to minimize casualties. But in the end, his protection had been an attempt to make me complicit in covering up fraud. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy to defraud investors, money laundering, obstruction of justice, making false statements to auditors. The scheme had been running for nearly 7 years, siphoning millions of dollars through fake vendor relationships and offshore accounts. The money had funded executive bonuses, personal investments, real estate purchases, luxury vehicles. Douglas Whitmore had used company funds to buy a vacation home in the Cayman Islands. Lawrence Bennett had purchased a yacht. Ruth Fitzgerald had invested in her husband's restaurant chain using what she'd fraudulently extracted from Octagon. And the compliance reviews? They'd been carefully stage-managed, showing auditors exactly what they wanted to see while hiding the underlying rot. Previous compliance officers had either been complicit or, like me, had been removed when they'd gotten too close to the truth. I wasn't the first person they'd silenced. I was just the first one who'd refused to stay silent.